Well, why don't we go ahead and begin? Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. Our webinar is all around cloud TCO and really a financial approach to making sure that you are optimizing your workloads, your clouds, full hybridization, and taking advantage of every opportunity you can. This webinar is kicking off right now. My name is Laurel Burton and I'm going to be your moderator today. I am going to start by giving you a little bit about today's agenda and then introducing you to our esteemed panelists that are joining me today. So for our agenda, obviously we'll talk about introductions in just a moment, but this is all about TCO and around your cloud and making sure that we're really taking advantage of those elements. So we're gonna start out with a few statistics and stories around TCO audits and what they can truly unwind for you. And then we're going to talk about some of the considerations. This is just an example of some of them we're going to talk about, but when you are doing your TCO modeling, we're going to look at virtual machines. Not all are equal. We're going to look at the analysis of price versus performance, refactoring, migrations, and many other considerations. Then we're going to go into an example out in the marketplace so you can see one in action. And last but not least, we would be remiss if we didn't share with you a little bit about Otava's hybrid models around our private resource and public cloud offerings, in addition to a colocation. So if you haven't met Otava already, we are cloud, colocation, security, disaster recovery, and data protection. We're excited to share all of that with you. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists to you today. As I mentioned before, my name is Laurel Burton. I am our VP of Marketing here at Otava. And in addition to myself, I am joined by Patrick Verhoeven from VMware. Patrick, maybe you can say hello, tell us a little about yourself, where you're zooming in from.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Great to be here again. So Patrick Verhoeven, I'm a cloud solution strategist with the VMware cloud practice. I've been with VMware for about 3 years. Prior to VMware, I worked with service providers, building and operating and delivering cloud services. So have been living and breathing cloud for many, many years. My kids tease me all the time. Have been working really closely with Otava recently, and we're really excited about the work that Otava is doing. They are absolutely aligned to VMware's vision and strategy for how we deliver, a hybrid cloud experience across different endpoints and how we can address and bring value and drive business outcomes for customers. So really excited to be here again today.
Thank you, Patrick. Also joining me today from Otava is our Director of Product Management, Jeremy. Jeremy, could you introduce yourself as well, where you're dialing in from, and a little background?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here today. I think this is going to be a pretty action-packed and albeit fun-filled webinar. Looking forward to the content here. I've been with Otava for about 5 years. Before that, I've worked leading practice areas in solution providers and SI firms across the Northeast. Now I'm coming to you from the warm, sunny state of Texas. We finally thawed out. So with that said, let's kick it off.
That sounds great. Thank you for the introduction. So we're going to dive right in and let's start with a few statistics to just get the conversation rolling. We've all talked about the concept of cloud. We're here because of cloud. And I think all of you would agree of its importance. So an interesting statistic to start us off from Frost and Sullivan, 75% of IT leaders say cloud is the most critical part of their digital transformation strategy. If you are on this webinar, you probably agree. And it's a good tee off to a couple more, not only the digital transformation strategy, but the whole concept of hybridization. And we know that it's here to stay. So 80% of IT leaders say that their hybrid cloud is essential to remaining competitive in the industry. And 93% of enterprises rely on multiple clouds. Hybridization is a reality. And as you can see from these statistics, that reality involves multiple clouds, multiple data centers, multiple options. And so when we're evaluating where to put our workloads, into which clouds, into which types of clouds, into which data centers, and if we're looking at that entire hybrid landscape, there's a lot to consider. And the question that I would pose to everybody is, are we truly are we truly taking advantage of all of these elements that we need to be looking at? So are we all doing that analysis ahead of time with regard to a technical analysis, a TCO analysis, and even an ROI, so we can look into the future and see what analysis may be there as well? Patrick, maybe you can lead us off by sharing a little bit about the definition of a TCO analysis and why it's important, and really what you can share around whether the leaders are doing their homework and the importance of that.
Yeah, so I mean, TCO is an important concept, right? And what we really want to do is kind of look at all of the elements that drive TCO, right? It's about the infrastructure required to deliver services and value. It's about the hardware and the software platforms that enable us to deliver the value. It's a lot about the value add services and the labor required to drive business outcomes as well. And so we need to look at TCO holistically across all those different elements. And a key thing is really making sure that we do an apples to apples comparison as well, right? We want to understand what is the TCO for running workloads on-prem, and then we want to look at that through the same lens as we evaluate different cloud environments and really take a holistic approach. And often, and I think you were kind of alluding to this, we mistake TCO with ROI, right? And we'll talk a little bit in this session about the differences there, right? Because one thing is what is the cost to deliver an outcome, but the other one has to do more with financial return and how do we drive time to value, and what does that look like, and when do we actually achieve a return on that investment? And we'll unpack some of those concepts in today's session.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Do you have a gut feel for what percentage of homework is really being done out there today?
Hard to say, but it's hard, right? Like in my experience, TCO models are either oversimplified or they're overcomplicated, right? The key is to strike that right balance, right? Where it's credible enough, where we know that we understand what the key assumptions are that are driving the economics of TCO, but we can also very quickly get down into the weeds, right? So that is the challenge. As I see lots of customers that just struggle with building TCO models because they go way too deep, but I also see customers that struggle with TCO because it's so high level that no one believes the TCO, right? So that is always the challenge, is striking that right TCO balance. And some organizations are very diligent about it. Others are less diligent about it. And the ones that are less diligent are often the ones that are maybe just looking at cloud through purely a strategic lens. They know that there are inherent benefits with the cloud, and no matter what TCO modeling they do, at the end of the day, it's not a TCO decision. It's more of a strategic decision, right? And that's a viable, valid point of view, right? So the customers that I talk to, right, they're really kind of all over the board, honestly.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, let's unpack a little bit of it, as you said, so we can understand the importance and really a way to do an effective readout. Before we do, Jeremy, I would love for you to give an example that really just shows, this is an interesting story that was recently in the news, and let's just show the importance of what an analysis might be able to show ahead of time if you do it up front.
Sure. So this, I think this is a well-publicized story. We probably have seen this multiple times, right? If you're up to speed on the news. Essentially, right, NASA moved a lot of its workload into AWS, but neglected to understand and really take into account egress charges, right? So they were hit with just an astronomical budget if they were to ever pull data out of that environment. And this, I think, speaks to some of the nuances in a true total cost of ownership analysis, right? Is understanding all of the different pricing models and metering options that are oftentimes present in some of the public cloud practices out there. And each public cloud is not created equal. There's different modeling based on the individual provider. But one of the key things that we have to look at, right, is not just the cost to host workloads, not just the cost to forklift our environment into that platform, but then the cost of operating that environment, right? API interchanges and calls, data read writes, data ingress, egress. Those are just some of the examples that oftentimes a lot of the folks that we've spoken with have not incorporated into their modeling. And then what that translates for, unfortunately, at the end of the day, is unexpected charges. Hopefully not to the same degree that NASA has here, right? But any charge that's not forecasted or expected is going to cause disruption to the organization. And this, I think, puts into some of the data that we'll unpack later on in the presentation around what are some of those components in a total cost of ownership analysis that need to be really thought about and factored in. And the point I'll leave this slide on is some of this may be beyond some of our abilities to understand, right? Do we know how many API calls we're making on a month in, month out basis? Do we know how many, how much data is getting sent east-west? Do we know how much data is getting pushed through metered appliances like a firewall or load balancer, similar that's metered on throughput? And if we don't know the answers there, I think we have to understand that there's a level of risk in looking at where workloads could live, and understanding that risk ahead of time helps us to avoid unexpected surcharges later on in the life cycle of that application.
Sure, that makes sense. In this particular example, it was all about ingress and egress, and maybe you can share for those that may not be as familiar what that means. For this particular case, I think they were realizing that by 2025, they were going to move from 32 petabytes of data to 250 petabytes of data. Can you kind of unpack what that means with regard to ingress and egress and why this sounded alarm bells?
Sure. So Amazon, as well as some other hyperscalers out there, charges for not only data coming into the environment, but also data transiting or exiting the environment, right? So were NASA to ever pull this data out, right, given their astronomical data size and scale here, were they to pull that data out, they'd get hit with a massive cost, right, far in excess of their budgeted amount for services here. So that what we essentially see here is vendor lock-in right now, because now they're in a position where they actually can't exit without spending that significantly high cost. So a little bit of a rock and a hard place that, again, exhaustive or a detailed approach to total cost of ownership on the front end likely would have caught that and allowed them to make a decision. They may have still made the same decision they did, but would have at least given them more information. Another customer that I won't name by name, right, moved an application, or an ISV moved an application into the Azure stack. And we'll talk a little bit about cost and price per performance here in a moment. But their business model was based on, a typical web pricing calculator that I'm sure all of us are probably familiar with. But in reality, when they actually ran that workload, and this is an ISV that's delivering services out to a constituent market and across the domestic US, they've actually found that to maintain the same performance they were used to, they actually had to quadruple their storage costs, moving up a storage performance tier and increasing size to drive the same level of performance. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of that analysis, right? That foots back, Laurel, to your earlier point around a technical analysis. Mm-hmm. But how much are we really driving into not just the total cost of operations and ownership, but also am I getting equivalent price per performance ratios in the hyperscalers? And I think we have some more information we'll unpack a little bit later on about that specifically.
And I think the net of that is that had that TCO analysis, had those 3 analyses been done on the front end, perhaps all of that could have been caught.
Exactly.
So a little bit more to you, Jeremy or Patrick, feel free to jump in. It does seem like in my world in cloud, and I've been in this industry for a long time as well, there seems to be some inherent biases in terms of types of cloud and what they're known for, and biases or assumptions in terms of what the TCO is going to prove out before you've even done it. One of the biases I can think of is that, hyperscalers are always going to be the best choice financially, and a private cloud may always be the best choice performance-wise. Let's talk a little bit about some of these biases, myths versus realities from a few factors. Maybe you can share a little bit about the challenge with the public clouds, but let's unpack it and talk about some of these biases and address it head on.
Yeah, so from my perspective, right, the hyperscale public clouds clearly have done a good job building out a very broad, deep set of services, right, and they're having a lot of success, right. But I think now that we're many years into this industry, right, customers are starting to recognize that there are certain blind spots, right, that they haven't maybe really fully thought through, right. And these are some examples of what those blind spots look like, right? Because like you said, if you go to a hyperscale public cloud pricing calculator, right, that is easy enough. But we need to think a little bit more broadly than that, right? So Jeremy talked a little bit about the egress charges, right, and the hidden cost, right? Gartner's done studies saying that customers typically are getting bills that are 2 to 4 times higher than they expect, right? Because hyperscale public clouds are not predictable, right? We think of them as predictable, but they're not, right? You don't really know what you're going to spend until the end of the month, until your consumption is done, right? And there's a level of complexity there, right? I was speaking with one customer that talked about the fact that EC2 alone, for example, has 10,000 SKUs and all these different pricing options, right? And that you need a PhD in cloud economics just to make sense of that, right? And then we think about the modern world where we have hybrid distributed architectures, right? So now you've got infrastructure and tools running on-prem, and you have different infrastructure and tools running in the cloud, right? So now we have multiple IT control planes that are introducing a level of complexity. And customer intimacy has always been a challenge, right? Hyperscale public clouds are great if what you want is a self-service experience. But if you're looking for that white glove, high-touch managed services experience, you're going to have to engage someone else, right? If you're consuming hyperscale public cloud infrastructure. And again, that's going to add to your cost, right? And then we see blind spots around performance, right? Lots of examples about open S3 buckets, right? Network latency. We see also some challenges, and on the one hand, the public clouds are very flexible because they give you lots of options, right? But there's also a degree of inflexibility there, right? Because, Jeremy kind of alluded to this. The more that we consume higher value PaaS services, so think of like RDS, for example, the more that's going to lock us into that cloud environment, right? The NASA example, right? How are they ever going to extract 250 petabytes of data out of that environment, right? So these are challenges that customers are struggling with as well. And then the last one that I see, right, is, not all workloads should be reworked, right? There's a cost and a time and a risk associated with whether you're replatforming or refactoring, right? There's an opportunity cost there, right? And so these are just some examples of the kinds of blind spots that we see where I think customers are starting to get a little bit more savvy about how and when they evaluate hyperscale public clouds. And again, I'm not saying don't use them. That's not my message, right? But every workload has a different set of requirements, and we just need to be thoughtful about where we deploy those workloads.
Right. I think that's very well put. Well, so I think we've laid out the landscape, and what I'd love to do is transition really over to some of the componentry that we need to consider in that TCO modeling. One of the first ones that I know you're passionate about, Patrick, is all around VMs.
Right.
They're not all the same. I'm going to let you dig
Absolutely
in.
not.
Let's talk about this relative to the modeling.
Yeah, so I hear this all the time, right? Is hyperscale public clouds are cheaper. They absolutely are not. It absolutely depends, right? And Jeremy was talking about this, right? We need to build the stack, we need to build the solution, and we need to look at this holistically, right? But let's start at the most basic fundamental level of an instance type, right? And really, the message here is not all VMs are created equal, right? We tend to think of as a VM being a VM being a VM, but that's just not the case, right? And the analogy here, right, is a car example, right? So, some of you may know this, but back during the Cold War in East Germany, they had this car called the Trabant, right? A super basic car with 4 wheels, an engine, and a steering wheel that would get you from point A to point B. But there were no seatbelts, there were no indicators, there were no odometers, right? It was just a bare bones car, right? And of course, we would never expect to pay the price of a Trabant for the performance that we get with a high performance sports car like a Ferrari, right? You're getting a lot more value, you're getting a lot more performance, and there is a cost and a price associated with that performance. And what you see in this table, for example, is I talked a little bit about 10,000 EC2 SKUs alone. So let's just take 3, right, examples. So, if we have a general purpose instance type that we want to deploy, and let's say it's a 4x16 VM, right? One option is to deploy a burstable T3 instance, right? Where we're getting a 40% vCPU performance baseline, right? In terms of performance. If we're below that percentage, right, we earn credits that allow us to then burst above 40%, right? So a good workload or a good instance type for very variable seasonal type workloads, and fairly inexpensive, right? So the list price there, if you do the math on a monthly basis, is like $180 per month. If you buy a 3-year reserved instance and prepay that, you get it for $118 per month, right? So maybe 10, 16 cents per hour, right? So that is certainly, where we often see customers comparing the price of one cloud to, say, an EC2 instance. But what we forget is when you look at the entire portfolio of EC2 instances, right, as we move up that spectrum, and again, there's many different examples, but just to illustrate the point, if we move to the right and look at an M5D instance, for example, here we are going to get better performance, right? We're going to get 100% CPU performance. We're going to get NVMe, SSD, storage performance, right? But there's a cost and there's a price associated with it, right? So now our list price has jumped to $276 per month, a 3-year reserved instance at about $194 per month. And my point here is just to make sure that everyone in the audience is thinking about the fact that not all VMs are equal. And we need to make sure that we're doing that apples to apples comparison, right? Just in this table alone, right, we see 130% price difference for what is considered a general purpose 4x16 instance type, right? So again, the devil's in the details, right? And this is where we just need to be thoughtful as we start to build our TCO models.
Right. And you kind of lead right into, I think, what you'd like to discuss next, with that price performance trade-off.
Yeah.
And then again, let's go into these details and have you share this. And then I would love for you to, give us examples of how you literally put this into that TCO and understand it.
Yeah. So it's not just about price, right? It's about value, right? And the way that we measure value is through price performance, right? And so, what this shows is some third-party research from a company called Cloud Spectator, and anyone in the audience can subscribe to their services as well. And at a high level, right, what Cloud Spectator has done is they've gone out and done some performance benchmarking of 10 cloud service providers in North America, right, where they measure VM performance based on CPU and memory and block storage performance. And what you see here is an index score that varies by a factor of 5, right, from best to worst. And again, what they did, you can see the table on the bottom right-hand side. They took several different instance types ranging from a 2x4 to a 16x32 VM. They ran it in these different environments. They applied their performance benchmarking tools. And maybe surprisingly, right, the hyperscalers didn't actually perform that well in this analysis, right? A lot of VMware cloud verified partners, right, and Otava absolutely, well, in fact, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, is a cloud verified partner as well, are actually demonstrating better performance and more consistent performance, right? So when we start to think about TCO and we start to think a little bit about that, right, we start to think a little bit differently in terms of the decision isn't just about the cost per VM, but it is also about driving the outcomes, right, for the business, right? We can get the cheapest instance type in the world, but if it's not driving the performance characteristics that we need, it's for naught, right? So there absolutely is this broader picture that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jeremy, any examples, any live situations here where you can fortify what Patrick was just sharing?
Yeah, I'll reiterate that story about the ISP, right? So picture an ISP who's providing SaaS-based services out to a fairly large consumer population in the country. They moved away from a VMware environment into Azure, thinking that environment was going to be more cost effective. And on paper, right, Excel spreadsheet or web spreadsheet, it certainly did appear to be, right? But in actual productivity, what they found is, and this is speaking specifically to the price per performance, they were not able to get the same level of performance. So what they actually had to end up doing is, again, quadrupling roughly the cost of their service delivery infrastructure to hit that same performance tier that they were used to getting. And consequently, at the end of the story, ended up being much more expensive than they actually were historically in the VMware platform. So there's a real level of benchmarking, I think, that should be factored into that migration strategy planning. Now, this is not to say, and I'll echo Patrick's point here, this is not to say that public clouds don't have a role in today's multi-cloud strategy, right? There are very specific workloads that take huge advantages of PaaS services and of other hyperscale services that should absolutely be leveraged in an organization's multi-cloud strategy. But that doesn't mean that everything is a one direction or not, right? It's important to look at an application or service supply chain within your organization and understand where that business service may be best served and best hosted, right? If you're creating cloud native applications, hyperscalers are phenomenal solutions for PaaS and other cloud native services, right? But if you've got a lot of legacy application architectures, and we'll talk about this in a moment, right? Refactoring those types of architectures is a huge cost to an organization and significantly extends the usable ROI that organization can expect from moving into that type of environment. So make sure we factor that carefully into our strategy.
Let's see, I have a slide on refactoring. I want to make sure it actually shows.
Yeah, just build that slide if you could, Laura.
I'm going to try. It is not letting me build it. I see it on my screen. Let's see.
So while you're working through that, so let me kind of talk to kind of the point of the slide, right? We don't have the full animation shown here, but really, you know, from my perspective, and actually, yeah, there you go, perfect. So when we think about, you know, where do we deploy a given workload, right? Like, we talked a little bit about this earlier, right? The blind spot around refactoring or replatforming an application. So let's assume that we have a traditional mode 1 3-tier application running on-prem, right? You know, we could just lift and shift that into a hyperscale public cloud, but generally speaking, that is not going to deliver the kind of economic advantage that you would expect, right? To really leverage and drive that TCO savings, we have to kind of think differently as we move those applications into public clouds. And so just here's one super simple example, right? Let's take the web tier alone, right? You know, you could deploy this into an EC2 instance, right? But again, that's not going to be hugely effective from a TCO perspective. What we are seeing that is driving TCO savings is refactoring that web tier into, for example, an architecture where we are deploying content, static content, in maybe an S3 bucket. Maybe we're using a Dynamo database where then our users are accessing through a authentication mechanism like Amazon Cognito, and then executing a Lambda function that will then serve up all of that content through an API gateway back to the tenant, right, and back to their web browser, right? So a very different construct in terms of how we serve content just for that web tier. But again, getting to this state, right, takes time and it takes expertise, right? And in some cases, this may absolutely make sense, right? Like Jeremy was talking about the fact that if you've got a mode 2 cloud native application architecture, and if it's a very fluid environment where you want to do a lot of development and you want to leverage some of those PaaS services, yeah, in that case, maybe it makes sense to take that step and refactor that application. But for many applications, right, it just doesn't make sense, right? So this is just one example of what we mean when we talk about, you know, replatforming or refactoring into a cloud native architecture.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know that there's some statistics that you can share around this as well. I'd love for you to jump in on these.
Yeah, so when we talk about that complexity, right, there's a real cost and there's a time element to that, right? So let's first talk about cost. So these are just some data points from some third-party analysts, right? So IDC conducted a global survey of over 400 companies, right, that were migrating apps from on-prem to native public clouds. And what they found is that on average, right, reworking 1,000 VMs was a 3-year journey and was going to cost about $1 million, right? And Gartner did a similar study, right? They estimate about $1,000 per VM to rework those into hyperscale public clouds. So these data points are actually remarkably close to one another. And, you know, sometimes, you know, you always need to have a healthy degree of skepticism around the analyst community, right? They're great thought leaders, but they don't always get it right. But I will tell you from VMware's perspective, we do see this with our customers, right? There was a very large financial services organization, for example, that was looking to move 300 applications into hyperscale public clouds. And they estimated, you know, $1 to $2 million per application. So this was going to cost them $600 million, and it was going to take them 4 years, which was a non-starter for them, right? And ultimately they decided to move forward with a VMware-based cloud, right? So my point is there is a real cost. And I think we see, the analysts are saying this, we see this, I think the Otava team sees this as well, right? So there's a real cost that we need to think about. And so again, we need to be thoughtful. Does it make sense, given the application, right, to rework that? There are times where it will make sense, and then there are going to be times where it does not make sense.
Yeah, and you're talking about application in a general sense, but perhaps Jeremy, you can give some examples, or Patrick, by vertical. I think there's a true difference, maybe a proprietary app or a legacy app. Can you explain by vertical some of the elements that you might see in terms of that burden refactoring could be? Seems like it hits some verticals harder than others.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think the key concept here, and this is true across many verticals, is a lot of traditional organizations that are undergoing digital transformation journeys, right, do have technical debt, right? And that technical debt is where we often run into problems, right? If you're a born in the cloud provider, like a SaaS vendor, you've probably built your business using cloud native constructs from the get-go, right? So this may be less relevant, but certainly think of any vertical industry: financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, right? These are industries and customers that have been around for many, many years, and they do have technical debt. That is just a reality, right? And again, this is why I think, one of the key things that we're also starting to see is a shift in the industry from a cloud first strategy to a cloud smart strategy, right? Even the US federal government recently came out and said they are moving to a cloud smart strategy. And what that means is essentially multi-cloud, a recognition that, they need to consume different clouds for different reasons, and also a recognition that they don't want to get dependent and locked into a hyperscale public cloud, right? So a lot of organizations are now starting to think about how does cloud first actually transition in this next decade into more of a cloud smart strategy.
And I would add on to that, Laurel. We think about verticals, right? We think about line of business applications and other application dependencies that those verticals require, right? Point of sale services, e-commerce or financial transactions in the financial market services. We think about healthcare with digital imaging and device interconnectivity and IoT for connected devices. Those types of dependencies also really need to be factored in early on in this process. Not everything will work the same way in every situation, and there could be technical blockers or limiters that organizations really need to think about and work through, both from a technical aspect, but also from a business and a financial aspect, before they put their multi-cloud strategy in place. So that would be our recommendation, is really look at the totality of the environment, but make sure we're thinking about the dependencies that each of our organizations use from an application and a SaaS platform perspective.
Right, that makes sense. Well, this slide was all about the costs around refactoring and rework. We're transitioning into now the time concept. So you've got the cost, and now we're looking at time.
Yeah.
Can you address?
Yeah, especially when we start to talk about ROI, right, and time to value, right? This is where this becomes critically important. And again, a lot of research out there. The Enterprise Strategy Group, did a survey, and they estimate that on average it takes 27 days to refactor and migrate a single application. So if you have 50 applications, that is a 3 to 4 year journey, right? This does not happen quickly. It does not happen overnight, right? And we have these board level mandates that are coming down where the CIO says, I need to move all of my applications into public cloud in a year's time. That is not happening, right? It just is not happening. Now again, not all applications are the same. There's the easy stuff, right? And then there's the difficult stuff. We had a large oil and gas customer, for example, that had like 400 VMs and had a cloud first mandate to move into public cloud. First 50 VMs went pretty easy, right? And then they hit a wall, right? And then the remaining of that estate ultimately got deployed into a VMware cloud environment, right? And you see another data point here from Tech Republic, right? 43% of customers are saying that their migrations are going to take more than 2 years, right? So again, lots of examples, right? From the analysts, from real world customer examples that we see at VMware, that this journey is not something that happens quickly.
Yeah.
Patrick, one thing that I think it may be understated on this slide as well is there's a level of technical competency required to appropriately refactor an application architecture from legacy to true, true PaaS-driven service architecture. And that technical competency in many of the organizations, at least that we speak with, doesn't exist today, right? There's an in-depth need to really understand true, mode 2 cloud native application architectures and services in order to be able to even initiate some of this refactoring. So there's a huge dependency there that may actually be unfulfilled in many of the target customers that we're speaking to.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's absolutely a skill shortage, right? To find good cloud architects that have modern app cloud native skills that also have a DevSecOps skill set. Those are not easy resources to find by any means. In fact, it reminds me of another data point that I came across, right? Foss and Sullivan, I think said that, most customers are struggling with their digital transformation journey. And as a result, 93% of them, I think was the statistic, are turning to partners like Otava to help them, right? Because, you guys do have those skill sets, right? You do have that experience and that muscle, right, to help customers on that journey.
That's salient. And it's not just the recruiting, it's retaining them, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
How do you get them on board and to stay with you when there's incentives galore all the way around? So very salient points. So we've talked about the VMs, we've talked about price versus performance, we're talking about refactoring. Let's talk a little bit about the workloads just in general. And in this particular case, the concept of the migration and the cost inherent here.
Yeah, so this is a great slide that kind of brings the whole story together, right? So this is a case study done by Gartner, right, for a composite customer moving 2,500 VMs from on-prem into a native public cloud. And there's a couple of key points on this slide, right? And the first thing that you see here is that this customer journey, this was a 3-year journey, right? Again, so some of the earlier comments that we made. Number 2 is you see at the end of year 3, right, the customer does get to a 55% TCO reduction, right? But that TCO reduction makes 2 really, really big assumptions that we might even challenge in some cases, right? The first assumption that it makes is you can see at the end of year 2, that really dark blue bar, that's the on-prem estate, that goes to 0. And I will tell you that evacuating your on-prem data center is a lot easier said than done, right? We have lots of technical debt. We have mid-range mainframe systems. We have commercial off-the-shelf software that may not even be supported in a hyperscale environment. We have lots of traditional end-tier applications where there's, it's a cash cow application, but there isn't a lot of documentation and the application owner has retired and is no longer there, right? So easier said than done. But let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that we've completely evacuated our data center, right? The second big assumption that you see here is at the end of year 2, you see that light blue bar ramp up, right? That is the public cloud spend, right? And we're starting to transition our workloads into a public cloud. And you can see that light blue bar actually gets quite high, right, by the end of year 2. And then in this case study, Gartner assumes that the customer has the skill sets to right-size their spend, right? To really understand how to optimize and drive down those costs, right? When and how do I use reserved instances, right? How do I decommission zombie assets, right? How do I enable right sizing? How do I schedule and provide policy-based governance so I can decommission environments in certain situations, right? That is not an easy thing to do, right? And again, most customers, I don't think, have that skill set. And so again, we're assuming that we optimize our public cloud spend, and then and only then do we get to that 55% TCO reduction.
Yeah, and after 3 years.
Yeah, and then the last key point here, I think, is we always have to remember, and this kind of goes to our earlier comments, that TCO is not the same as ROI, right? So in this example, the customer isn't even ROI positive until year 7. Right. And by the end of year 3, I think they're negative 171% from an ROI perspective. And the main reason for that is if you look in year 1, you see these really tall gray bars, right? Those gray bars represent those blind costs that we talked about earlier, those blind spots, right? The cost, time, and risk of replatforming or refactoring your applications. And in this example, we're assuming the customer's replatforming. If you're refactoring, I would argue that cost is going to be even greater, right? And so here you can really see how, yes, we might get to a TCO reduction if we make some big assumptions, but we are not ROI positive until year 7. And and one last comment, I guess, because I love this slide. I think it tells a real story, right? You know, when you think about, you know, again, let's go back to the concept of cloud smart, right? You know, we're not saying that workloads shouldn't land in hyperscale public clouds. What we are saying is be thoughtful about which workloads land where, right? Think about, you know, cloud smart instead of cloud first, right? And you know, work with a trusted advisor that can help guide you on that journey, because fundamentally what a VMware-based cloud is going to do is two key things, right? It's going to greatly compress that timeline from 3 years to months, right? And it's going to largely eliminate that migration bubble cost, right? The cost of replatforming or refactoring becomes greatly simplified when we're moving from vSphere to vSphere, right? And these are the things I think where Otava brings a tremendous amount of value.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It is. This is a powerful slide. There is a lot hiding in here too. You could do a whole webinar just on this slide.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
We probably will. Thank you. I think those are very good observations. And maybe this is the appropriate time to start tying it all together. A bit of an eye chart here, but this is the IDC 5C framework. Jeremy, and why don't you jump in here, and I'll have Patrick do color commentary, but you've covered a lot of these already, gentlemen, in terms of elements that you need to consider in that TCO modeling. Costs, capabilities, customization we haven't talked about yet, and I'd love for you to jump in. The consumption models, right? How much variability do you have? And then something we haven't discussed yet, compliance. Jeremy, can you cover a couple of these that are gotchas that we've discussed, but maybe only tangentially? Can you jump in a little bit and add more?
Sure. I think when we think about a TCO, again, there is a balance, as we've stated earlier, about level of detail here, but it is important to make sure that all of the potential cost factors are appropriately identified and charted into that TCO analysis. Some of the things that I think we tend to overlook more times than not, and I'll start sort of top down here, right, is a lot of the metered services in public cloud, right? API, data ingress, egress, data rights to cool or cold storage, those types of metered services. We don't have a lot of data historically in our environment to be able to understand what our utilization profile is on that. So therefore, it becomes very difficult for us to understand what the costs are, even if we're looking at those costs. So there's some formative work that has to be done in a TCO analysis there to really understand how we're using our infrastructure and our environments today. In the capability perspective, performance, right? We talked about price per performance earlier. Performance really comes into play, right? It's easy to go through a web-based calculator, but stand an instance up in the environment that you're looking at and actually measure or gauge your performance in that environment versus what you're doing today on-prem. And understand the deltas or the similarities there so that you can accurately size and ensure that the performance you're getting in the environment that you're planning on is actually going to give you the results you need or the business demands. From a customization standpoint, high availability here, and this also talks to consumption, right? One hyperscaler out there will invalidate their SLA for resiliency if you're not in 2 different availability zones. Forget that you have 2 different VMs, but those actually have to be in 2 different availability zones for you even to be able to recover SLA cost relief for downtime or disruption. Mm-hmm. So look into those nuances, right? And as you can see here, it becomes a pretty complex process very quickly. But this is important because this is what causes those unpredictable, unforeseen charges at the end of the month. And that's, I think, our biggest concern when we talk to organizations about a multi-cloud strategy is being able to provide insight and guidance to allow price predictability so that there isn't significant overages. One last piece, and I'll mention this here at the close, right? Compliance. Exciting to see some of the hyperscalers out there now coming out with compliant cloud, gov cloud, and similar. But those come at a cost. So if you really do need compliant services in cloud, understand that you need to make sure that you are providing that type of a compliance architecture for your application hosting so that you can maintain that compliant coverage.
That makes sense. Thank you. There's, again, a whole other webinar that could be just on this. I think we've covered a lot of them, but more to dig in at any point, and we'd be happy to help any of you in the audience on it. So let's transition a bit. We've talked about some of those elements in the TCO. Now it's all about where to begin, right? So Jeremy and Patrick, but let's talk a little bit about this high level. So where do you begin? And here's some key elements to think about just at a very 50,000 foot level. Let's discuss.
So the first thing I would suggest, right, is look at cloud as and Patrick coined the term, and it's been used in the industry. It's not a cloud first, right? Everything's not going to automatically forklift into one environment, right? It is a cloud smart, and it has to be done at a workload by workload basis, right? I think we can all think about the different types of workloads in our environments today that run and drive our business operations. And that's really the level of granularity we need to take a TCO to really understand where those workloads are best served from a technical requirements perspective, from a price performance perspective, and then from a supportability and operational perspective, right, in terms of internal assets and expertise. That helps us understand sort of our migration strategy, right, of which areas can benefit most based on the workload requirements. Conducting the TCO analysis, I think we've covered the major rocks there, but I will offer on behalf of the Otava team, engage us if you want hand-holding or help through this process. If you want some expert advice or opinions, we're happy to work with you in putting together that analysis at a workload by workload level, and understand a couple here now, big rocks for successful migrations. One is bidirectionality. Don't put yourself in the NASA situation where you're in an environment you can't extricate yourself, right? Vendor lock-in is a real challenge today. And it's not only a challenge because of technology limitations, it's also a challenge from financial limitations, as we saw. So make sure that we're looking at ways that we can have fluidity, right? And expect as the multi-cloud technologies in the arena continue to evolve, expect the desire for us to have true application portability across cloud instances. And that's going to be driven by organizational change and evolution. It's going to be driven by your markets. It's going to be driven by your client needs and other objectives. Understand your internal skill sets, right? Don't look at or plan on application refactoring or PaaS services restructuring for cloud native if you don't have those skill sets on staff today. It is not for the faint of heart. These are pretty complex processes, and you can materially impact application performance, security, or stability if it's not done appropriately or correctly. Understand how to balance consumption, right? Understand that in many of our legacy architectures, we adopted 24/7, 365 assumption, right? That we have an application, it's up and running and functional, and we don't really think about it past that uptime and availability discussion. But in cloud, right, utilization is cost. So if I can understand my utilization trending with those application services, I can then understand how I can balance true utilization versus some of the tasks that Patrick was talking about earlier around right sizing. How do I drive it with policies? How do I drive appropriate policies to lower my overall cost? And then last but not least, understand how we can minimize application operational complexities, right? How do I delegate application workloads away from maybe a central IT department to business owners to allow them to be more agile in their utilization and consumption or steering there? How do I minimize complexity in the environment? This goes back to application refactoring, right? I don't want to create a completely complex and unsustainable environment if I've got to now support that. And those headcount costs for me to support that may be magnitudes higher than what my headcount costs are today. So all of this wraps into an overall cloud strategy for migration and as part of a TCO analysis. And again, I'll close with Otava certainly willing and able to participate with you in those types of analytics and discussions.
Yeah, Jeremy, I love everything you said, right? Spot on. It completely aligns with our view as well. And I think the key thing here is applications drive cloud strategies, right? So that's where we start, right? And we need to understand, what are we going to retain on-prem? What are we going to rehost? What are we going to replatform? What are we going to refactor? What are we going to retire and maybe replace with SaaS, right? And at the end of the day, that is ultimately what's going to drive the cloud venue, right? And some of these questions, Jeremy alluded to this, are a little bit more complex than you realize, right? Like there's absolutely a benefit with a cloud native architecture, right? It makes developers much more productive. We can rapidly iterate code and iterate new features, but like anything in life, it comes with a trade-off decision, right? And the trade-off decision that we're making there is now we are creating new security challenges and new networking challenges. Now we have a whole bunch of microservices that are talking to each other, right? And we need to think about, how do we create observability and management around all of that network communication, and how do we secure those containers, right? So like anything in life, there's trade-off decisions, right? And that's what we want to really be thoughtful about.
Yeah, well put, well put. So great summary, gentlemen. I appreciate all of these recommendations here, and let's now pivot over to Otava, and maybe where Otava and VMware can really help our clients here. So Jeremy, why don't you share a little bit about what Otava offers in terms of our Gen 3 cloud? And I'm going to start by just saying, hey, I see multiple flavors here. Can they complement, or do they replace something like a hyperscaler? How does one consider, again, multiple cloud hybrid strategies here with regard to this platform?
So one thing I'll say, Laurel, and I think the answer is quite honestly both, right? We're not going to ever be an AWS or an Azure. However, a lot of what the feature and functionality requirements are for organizations that want to consume multiple cloud services can be done through these varied options, right? Everything from a true shared pay-as-you-go utility-based experience through a true private architecture. But the core benefit, I think, of this approach is really one that minimizes a lot of the cost, complexity, and delay in cloud migration. We're essentially giving organizations the same architectures they've had on premise. So the migration risk, complexity, and delay, right? We think about total cost of ownership, but we also think about that return on investment delay that we just learned about, can be significantly shortened by moving into a like environment, getting the same benefits of cost for utilization versus capital expense, but being able to do so in a manner that doesn't mandate application refactoring or mandate additional technology skill sets internally for our operations teams. So that type of model there, I think, has significant benefit. The other piece here that I think is uniquely differentiated is the concept of a hybrid billing model, where there's a concept of a fixed fee service for what many hyperscalers today meter and bill, and many of our customer organizations don't have the intelligence or the insight into how their applications are performing to be able to predict that. So that fixed fee provides them predictable monthly costs that they can now budget and have a safety net to ensure that those costs are not going to grow or expand, with also consumption-based for infrastructure resources. So consumers can scale up and down as they need to and pay for what they're utilizing versus, again, that capital allocation model.
So you're saying there's some flexibility. It's the client's choice whether they want to do a usage-based model or a fixed fee.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit more, a few more of the details here on the Otava Cloud?
So the Otava Cloud is really designed with the end user experience in mind, right? We see the organization shift. Patrick, I'd be curious to see what your perspective is on this as well. But we see a lot of our organizational objectives shifting now from a buy, build, own, operate legacy architecture model into a utility model, right? I simply want to consume services when and how I need to, and I don't want to have to deal with managing or maintaining those services to the greatest extent possible. And that's really designed where the core fundamental components around the Otava Cloud, right? Simplicity, easy to operate, easy to deploy, easy to manage, right? looks, feels, and acts like a premise-based architecture without all the cost and complexity of premise, but also is a full-featured multi-use platform that also includes disaster recovery and data protection services built into that user experience, and supports hybridity, supports that multi-cloud thesis, where we can now connect environments hosted within Otava's Gen 3 cloud into other public cloud providers, as well as premise-based applications that for whatever reason may not be able to be moved. And that's really the core, I think, outcomes that I would reinforce here.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. And one more piece on that. Let's talk a little bragging rights here about Otava and our recent mention in Forrester Wave.
Sure. So I'm sure most of our audience is familiar with Forrester. Forrester does something similar to the Gartner Magic Quadrant. They have a wave report, and it really seeks to measure organizations that they're interviewing on a couple key areas, right? Service maturity, service offering depth and breadth, service provisioning in terms of ease of customer experience and overall customer experience outcomes. And then last but not least, their roadmap and strategy for that platform. All of that factors into a placement in this wave report where, similar to Gartner, upper right is where you want to be, lower left is where you don't want to be. And it's interesting to also note that that in this particular case as well, Forrester's also built in a sixth dimension into this, which is market penetration and market presence. So Otava, this is our first year on the Forrester Wave. We were incredibly excited to see where Forrester put us, and they've placed us, as you can see here, really in that upper middle quadrant area. Which is exciting for the first year that Gen 3 was released. This is our Gen 3 cloud platform. And it's really focused around how Otava is using Gen 3 exactly to what we've talked about here, to meet the needs of organizations who are looking to move into cloud and adopt a cloud strategy, but do so in a way that is non-disruptive and simplistic for them to adopt and then operate moving forward.
Yeah, so chosen out of 11 providers out of so many, we're in that top 11, strong performer. We're thrilled about it, and we see nothing but growth here. But it really is all about that full integration with VMware, that entire integration, the entire integration, not only with VMware, but with all of our complementary services across security, across data protection, across the other DR as well, right? So that integration was a huge component of why that win is there too. So thank you. By the way, at any point, if you want to ask any questions, by all means, go ahead and enter it in chat, and we sure will. And in the meantime, let me just take it home. We're thrilled about that Forrester Wave mention, but we're equally thrilled about Otava just as a whole. And we do, as Otava, have an entire portfolio from which you can choose. So, you know, if you take a look here, Otava is definitely a secure and compliant hybrid cloud provider, but we are well entrenched when it comes to backup, DR, business continuity, that entire realm of data protection, especially for those that are consuming large amounts of storage. It comes right back into this TCO modeling and why you want to take a look at some of our options. Co-location, security, and then the professional services. So if you'd like to have us help you with an analysis, we'd be happy to. Any of these products, we are doing free trials on. So jump in. Let's get in a sandbox. Let's get dirty together and talk about them. Otava tends to position itself and tends to really differentiate in terms of those clients that have security and compliance sensitivities. So not only are our data centers, but our solutions are all compliant at no additional cost to you. So compliance clouds don't come at an extra fee. It is the standard fee. Again, right back to that TCO. So we'd love for you to give us a call. We'd love to have you set up on a sandbox and try us out for size. A little bit about Otava while we're looking to see if there's any questions. If you haven't heard about us, I sure hope you will and call us after this. Otava, we are a cloud and co-location hosting provider. Obviously, I think you get that. As I said, we're positioned perfectly for that secure and compliant sensitive industry verticals and service providers there. Our whole range of services range from, that hybrid private and public cloud, data protection, DR, security, co-location, hybridization is what we do. It's what we follow. And we have a concept here, and it's the concept that cloud shouldn't be tough. And with Otava, it's easy. We want to break the mold. We want to jump away from, inavailability of resources and inavailability of humans to helping you see that we're going to be consultative, high touch all along the way. And that's how we deliver our exceptional results. So we want to help you through that transformation journey with those analyses that you saw in the beginning. Let us help you do those. Let's jump in together. All of the compliance that we talked about, compliance centers and solutions at no additional fee, very flexible options. And the real point here is that everything is fully customizable. So we want to customize the cloud to tailor to you as opposed to you having to fit something else. So, our concept here is that it shouldn't be tough. With Otava, it's easy. And with that, I'd like to just summarize again and let you know that demos, we are all about a demo or a conversation. So at any point, any of those products, let's have that conversation. Are there any questions that we need to address? I don't think there are. I think we were very thorough. With that, I just want to say thank you. Patrick, it is always a pleasure having you join our webinars. I want to thank you for that continued partnership and all of the intel that you bring to us and to our audience. Thank you, thank you. Jeremy, great insights in terms of the product portfolio and where we need to concentrate. Thank you for your joining us. With that, like I said, reach out to us. Let's do a demo. Let's have a conversation and let's get you on that cloud journey. I'm Laurel signing off, and thank you for participating in our webinar today. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.